Good morning, everyone. I'm Hugh Jones, Chief Executive Officer of Steer. Welcome to the first seminar in our series Net Zero by 2030 Fact or Fiction. Delighted to be joined by Naomi Green, Director at England's Economic Heartland. Numbers are still building, so I'm just going to give us another minute or so to get towards our expected number of delegates. We're expecting around about 130 of us, and we are slowly building up. So just please bear with us as numbers start to build, and then we will make a start. So good morning again. We're now a minute after the hour. For those of you that just joined in the last moment or two, I will reintroduce myself. I'm Hugh Jones, Chief Executive Officer of the Steer Group, and I'm absolutely delighted that everybody has been able to join us this morning, the morning after the final deliberations at COP26, and I'm even more delighted that our opening speaker in this series of seminars is Naomi Green from England's Economic Heartland. By way of a reminder, this is the first of 5 seminars that we are running through the course of this week, each morning of the week, focusing on net zero and the associated commitments. Each time our seminars will pick up a different theme, a really great programme of engagement and discussion through the week, which you can sign up to by visiting steergroup.com. Today, our focus will be transport policy and strategy, recognising the role that transportation plays in the emission of carbon and also the opportunity to reduce the impact of transport, whilst balancing some of the very many other attributes that transport delivers. Some housekeeping before we start, and I introduce you all to Naomi. This session is recorded, and the recording will be used within Steer's social media and website. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please ask questions by posting the questions in the meeting chat, stating your name and the company or organisation that you represent, as well as providing the question. And then we will direct our questions to Naomi at the conclusion of the event. We'll also be producing some summary scripts and briefing packs, which will be circulating to delegates after the event. So enough from me. I'd like to introduce Naomi Green, our guest, to you all today. Naomi is Director at England's Economic Heartland and is currently the Programme Director. She's responsible for delivering EEH's work programme and the implementation of the regional transport strategy through to 2050, ensuring that England's Economic Heartland is driving forward the ambitions for economic growth and decarbonised transport system as it does so. Naomi and team place a very strong commitment and emphasis on place-based approaches to planning and investment, and we are really looking forward to hearing more from Naomi this morning. Naomi, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I was just checking that I was unmuted as well. I am delighted to be here today to kick off the week of Steer's Movement Matters seminars. It's a really critical agenda for us, and we're delighted to talk to you about the work that we're doing. If I could move to the next slide, please. Just by way of introduction, England's Economic Heartland is one of 7 subnational transport bodies covering the whole of England outside of London. We work with our regional constituent local authorities, LEPs and the Department for Transport to prioritise regional investment in transport and connectivity infrastructure. DFT expects us to be ambitious, collaborative and to deliver with impact. The STBs are a significant and growing presence on the transport planning landscape. We're trying to act as a bridge between central government and local authorities, a point for setting strategy and identifying those investment priorities. But we do so much more than that. The scale of our geographies and the collaborative nature of the partnerships that we've formed means that we can really support local authorities to address some of the major issues facing our country at the moment. And naturally, decarbonisation of our transport system is and has to be at the heart of what we do. As an STB, England's Economic Heartland leads the 7 STBs in our work on decarbonisation, and is in that context that I'm delighted to speak to you today. I have, however, indulged myself in making use of some of the data that we have in the EEH region, really to bring to life the case for action and what the next steps need to be. So while it's quite EEH focused in terms of data, the implications of that data far-reaching across the country. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of a little bit of background, England's economic heartland, the Heartland region, is a real economic success story. It's a centre for science and technological innovation, powered by a network of world-leading universities and research centres. And for decarbonisation, we really do see this as a jewel in our crown. We do have the innovative sector in the region that can help us navigate our way through this challenge. It's also a region of heritage, of culture, a rich natural environment, historic city centres, and vast areas of rich natural capital that actually make planning, transport and connectivity quite difficult because of the need to be sensitive and respectful of the region that we work in. It's a national asset. We operate and compete on a global scale, and we leverage net economic benefits for the exchequer and the country as a whole. And that's a really significant part of the contribution that we play to the country. But it is also a region of challenges. Poor transport connectivity leaves many in rural areas with really limited choices on the way that they travel, and connectivity is a contributing factor when it comes to social inequality in the region. Our residents are likely to travel further and use their car more often than the national average. And carbon emissions from transport are about 10% higher in our region than the national average, and they are increasing faster. There is a real clear need for action. If I could go to the next slide, please. So this slide sets out our transport carbon emissions from per capita. So in 2017, transport emissions were about 40% of the Heartland's total emissions, compared to 37% nationally. In places like Buckinghamshire, it's up to 50% of emissions come from carbon from transport. It's really quite significant. And what you can see from this map is the darker the colour, the higher the level of emissions from transport, carbon emissions from transport. What we can see is there's a clear correlation between high emissions and the strategic road network. You can see in Daventry and South Northamptonshire, that's kind of the beginning of the Golden Triangle for freight, but also down in South Buckinghamshire where the M25 passes. But there's also a clear link between some of our really rural areas like Huntingdonshire and South Cambridgeshire, where the car mode is naturally higher. So what we know from this is that one solution alone won't solve it. If I could just go to the next slide, please. So the question we're discussing today is actually decarbonisation by 2030. Some local authorities have declared climate emergencies and set such targets, but really, how viable is it? So let me introduce you to Lucy. Lucy is a Heartland resident, and she has spent her whole life in North Northamptonshire. Lucy will be 18 in 2030. By that time, at the moment, where a rail journey for Lucy between her local station of Kettering and Cambridge currently takes a generalised journey time of 201 minutes, that's 3 hours. By the time she turns 18 in 2030, East West Rail will be delivered. She will be able to access opportunities across the region and housing choices that are currently geographically out of her reach, and she'll be able to do so in a much more sustainable way. The opening of public transport like East West Rail, which is a transformative scheme, will fundamentally change the way that Lucy can make her travel choices in 2030, in 9 years' time. But her travel choices need to be influenced now. And some of the things that we need to do now are make sure that she has access to good walking and cycling, good public transport, so that she can embed those behaviours into the choices that she makes in the future. And that's where the responsibility on all of us is not to actually look through to 2030, but to start to make the planning now. For Lucy, at the moment, the environment in North Hampshire has its challenges. Carbon emissions in this area are 26% above the national average. But far more challenging than that, only 28% of those carbon emissions are derived from local journeys. The rest is longer trips. And that's where it shows that the issue of place-based transport decarbonisation is not an issue that local authorities can solve alone. It requires a collective and targeted effort, a local effort, a regional effort, and a national effort. Thank you. Please can I go to the next slide? So what does this actually mean? It means a whole systems approach. And what I've done is I've lifted out some fantastic work done by the Royal Town Planning Institute published in January this year, that shows the pathway to net zero that might need to be approached for a place-based approach to decarbonisation. So if you look at the left of the slide, it shows the trajectory of decarbonisation that needs to be achieved. This is to achieve net zero by 2050. In a do-nothing scenario, we would actually see carbon emissions rise nationally by 7% by 2030 as new developments contribute to increased trip demand. However, to counter that and to get to net zero within the legal timeline, what we can see on the far right in the pink is what you can achieve from switching fuels. It is a huge amount, absolutely. But that alone will not do it. And it's the middle section, the substitution of trips and the switching of modes, where place-based decarbonisation really needs to contribute towards towards our overall approach. Please can I go to the next slide? So how can strategy support this? First of all, the government's Transport Decarbonisation Plan, published in July 2021, was world leading in parts. Its ambition towards transition to EV are exemplary, but it is missing the other half of the jigsaw, the half that I showed you in that slide before, the place-based approach. The government's Transport Decarbonisation Plan has references to place-based decarbonisation, but at the moment it's not backed up by the right regulation, the right infrastructure and the right investment to deliver that. And that's the part that we all need to work together to help solve. It's the really challenging part of the jigsaw. So yes, we need electrification in our railways and our roads and sector-wide innovations. They are pivotal to the success of the UK effort to decarbonise. But through decarbonisation, we can actually take the opportunity. We can make our regions nicer places to live and work and more attractive places to invest if it is done well. We need to recognise that our current pattern of travel and consumption of resources is not sustainable, and we need to work together to address that. We need to look at pricing. We need to look at other options to think about what needs to do to achieve the behaviour change. Walking, cycling and new mobility solutions need to play a big part in the transition, and we need a market-led approach to planning mobility. Finally, we need to prioritise infrastructure investment proposals, not just on the basis of offering good value for money, as we so often do, but their contribution towards achieving net zero and their contribution towards wider sustainability and environmental goals. We need to really look at the way that we prioritise investment and be able to see different transport priorities coming through, not just local prioritisation, regional prioritisation, but through the transport planning and investment appraisal process in the Department for Transport. The whole system needs to be reviewed to reflect what needs to happen to actually invest in those infrastructure solutions that can help towards net zero. If I could go to the next slide, please. And one of the projects that I just wanted to pick up with you that England's Economic Heartland has been leading, working actually in partnership with Steer as well, has been to take a market-led approach to planning local first last mile journeys as part of a bigger strategy for sustainable travel across the region. What we've done is we've used Experience Mosaic data to look at the different types of communities that we have across the region. The selection that I've got here is a community where up to 40% of the residents are the same type of persona, aspiring homemakers. This is quite common in the England's Economic Heartland region, where overall about 14% of this particular are aspiring homemakers. But in pockets of our communities, generally where there are new housing developments, up to 40–45% are the same type of people. Aspiring homemakers tend to have all the adults in the household working. They have a high appetite for new forms of mobility. They're dependent on their mobile phones as a form of communication. They are a market type that will respond to new forms of mobility, to shared forms of mobility, providing that we actually put them in place, that people, place, movement approach to planning transport. That's one of the types of ways that we can do this, and we're working closely to try and embed and roll out this model across our region, so that when we put infrastructure in, we know that it's designed for the people that have the ability to use it, and giving them the right choice in what they can do to actually enable them to make the changes that they need to make personally to contribute towards this big, overwhelming duty that we have. So I'm going to pause there. There was a number of themes that went through the presentation, but I wanted to give enough time for discussion and debate.
Firstly, I'm going to say thank you for such a rich presentation, really taken by a number of points in it, but particularly the very challenging distribution of carbon emissions you have, but the very different characteristics of some of the solar areas that make up your region, and totally agree with the points you made about the need to look at transport schemes through a wider lens with more component parts to really understand what they can deliver in pursuit of a wider policy scenario, and to look beyond the benefit cost ratio. I think that was an incredibly well made point. Perhaps a number of questions just starting to come in. Perhaps we better start with a key question of context, if that's okay. What's your commentary on COP26, and what do you think it means for you and colleagues in EEH, or those just generally charged with taking forward the decarbonisation of the transport network?
I mean, I think the profile of COP is a fantastic opportunity for all generations within the country to actually understand the responsibility to respond to decarbonisation, not just transport, but across the mix. Actually, one of the challenges for us is it's very easy to make big, broad strategic statements about what you're trying to achieve, and they are really important to do that through deals and negotiation. But the reality is, they need to be backed up with plans for delivery. And I think any announcements that were made at COP around net zero for freight, etc., were welcome and absolutely essential to take forward the agenda. But the reality is, the devil is in the detail with this, and we just need to move on to actually understand. I know from an electric vehicles point, the power supply in our region is probably about half what it needs to be able to support a fully electric fleet of cars. So when you layer in electrified railways, if that's another route that we need to go down, which we obviously prioritise as a region but need to deliver, the pressure on the power supply is enormous, and it's that whole scale thing that we need to deal with, not just sort of transition to fuel, to EV.
Brilliant, thank you. And question from a colleague at Steer, Stephen Bishop. Thank you very much. Question focused on behaviour change, which I think was something you talked to very eloquently when talking about helping Lucy make future travel choices. How do you see the best way of achieving that very radical behaviour change that's necessary, and keeping the public on side as we go through various interventions that are required to deliver a lower carbon transport network?
Well, I mean, I think if I start with myself and an honest question to myself, whether, given that I have access to an awful lot of data, am I making the travel choices that I need to make to respond to transport decarbonisation? The truth is probably not. And if I look at why, it's because of the pressure points that I have to balance alongside that, which would be price elasticity, vulnerability, needing to balance pressures of time. So when you look at what needs to happen for behaviour change, really you need to look at how we price transport, how we ensure that people can afford to make a different choice, and actually make it an attractive choice through pricing. And I've had a number of examples where this is not just about stick, this is about carrot, where you could actually, you can offer incentives to reduce driving during peak times, for example, through the use of ANPR. The technology is there to allow us to do all sorts of incentives, as they've done in Europe before, but it has to be backed up by real access to public transport. I know there is a growing debate around whether you actually entirely shift what you pay for and make public transport much cheaper and transfer the cost onto roads. That is a politically very challenging thing to do. But I think the discussion needs to be had on price and on time. The way that England's economic heartland approaches this is that actually, use of a vehicle is not a bad thing. You have an absolute right to use your private car, but people need choice, and they need to be able to have access to alternatives so that 20–30% of the time they can make different behaviour choices, and they have access to that, to the transport to actually do that. At the moment in our region, in many places, that's actually not possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree on the point on pricing. Seems like an opportunity that needs to be taken. So a question from Bronwyn Thompson to yourself, Naomi, from the Clarion Housing Group. What do you think that the future models of movement are within newly developed communities?
In fact, Bronwyn, that's a fantastic question and a really exciting area that that we could facilitate some huge opportunities for change with the right funding in place to do it, of course. I think one of the areas is obviously around small-scale freight and managing access to developments from freight deliveries. We've all seen a huge increase in small-scale freight during the pandemic, and there is a real opportunity to design freight differently into new communities. But much more than that, the ability to design a community where public transport and walking and cycling takes the priority will allow people, again, that choice. And we've seen, particularly in some of the areas in our region, Oxford and Cambridge, for example, the demand for sustainable transport is a core part of where you choose to locate. That said, I equally recognise that for developers, there is a need to sell housing to as many people as possible, and the demand for car spaces is absolutely understandable. But it's where, if you put the public transport in first, people can see a viable alternative, and then you can work with developers to really intelligently design communities where people can make the most of public transport. One of the things that we're doing on East West Rail, for example, is working with local authorities to maximise the impact of the first last mile, so that you almost broaden the station catchment by having really good, viable public transport and walking and cycling access to stations, so people feel that that station is part of their local community, even if it is just a little bit further away, but they know they can get there through a shuttle bus or an e-scooter or whatever form of transport works for that region, that area.
Thank you. Can't see the originator of this question, so apologies. I'm going to take somebody's question in an unattributed fashion. Naomi, how would you harness the great powers of innovation that exist in your area to move at a quicker pace through towards our decarbonisation goals?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that we grapple with quite a lot. One of the challenges, I think, is about where you've got innovation in companies and they're trialing new forms of technology. To then move that into the mass scale actually requires support from government or local authorities or Innovate UK, for example. It's that step from a pilot to actually an activity of sufficient scale that it can be measured and transformative. I think that is where the public-private partnership really comes into it. I don't think we do it enough, and I think there is appetite for it. The Department for Transport's Future of Mobility Regulatory Review, which has been through its first stage, there's another stage open at the moment, is opportunities for us to identify where regulation is a problem in implementing innovation. That's one step, but then funding is a second step. But to be honest with you, I really believe that together the public and the private sector can do an awful lot more in this way, and it's not something that we're doing enough of. And actually, interestingly, the market-led approach that I was talking about at the end, the people, places, movement sort of work, gives innovators access to information about those markets where actually we believe there are people that are more likely to take up particular forms of transport. So when we were developing that project last year, we quite often talked about how, if you, for example, e-bike trials at the time would naturally go to a city centre, but what they're possibly missing is those communities where, for example, 40% is of one type. That's a huge catchment of people that might have a high propensity to use that form of transport that might be missed by the private sector because they don't have a natural need to that level of data on the scale that we have it. And I think that's the sort of thing that we can bring to the market to help the market respond to where demand is probably already there, latent demand that we're not matching.
Thank you. And don't forget, plenty of opportunities, attendees, to pose more questions. Question from Kate Gifford at the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. Kate, thank you very much for asking the question. Kate says, hi, Naomi. You've talked about pricing of transport. Are you aware of good examples in England's economic heartland where authorities have developed a mobility credits scheme to help incentivise the use of sustainable modes?
I don't think we've got any yet. I think some of our authorities, like Oxfordshire, are making really huge steps forward in terms of their future. Their next refresh of their local transport plan is currently out for consultation, and that is really ambitious in terms of mechanisms for achieving behaviour change. But I'm not aware yet, unless it's small scale initiatives that we probably wouldn't get involved in within our region.
Thank you.
But it's those kind of examples where actually as a sector we should draw together across regions and capture where there is best practice and allow other local authorities and combined authorities to draw on each other's expertise. And I think the subcontinental transport bodies have quite an important role to play in doing that.
Thank you. Please don't forget, further questions, do pop them in the chat and we will present them to Naomi, who's giving amazing answers. Naomi, if you don't mind, I'd quite like to ask a question of you. If you could change one thing, gain one extra power for England's economic heartland, bring forward one bit of innovation at a much greater pace, what would that wish list look like?
Am I allowed two?
You can have as many as you like.
So my first one is around ticketing. At the moment, ticketing is such an enormous barrier to people making transport choices. It's bordering on impossible to have comparable price journeys of you know, an end-to-end journey by sustainable travel, you know, with a combination of modes versus your car. Actually, you can't really compare them. You can't price naturally, and you can't get a single ticket. It's quite unpredictable. That is a really frustrating thing to deal with, and it's a very complex area of transport policy and regulation. But we're absolutely, that needs to change. The second one is actually, I think, about flexibility on trialing different types of pricing, and that, by that I mean carrot and stick. It's definitely not about punishing people for driving. It's about giving incentives for change, like the example I talked about on the continent, where people were paid €5, I think, a day to not use a particular stretch of road in the AN peak, and over a sustained period of time that continued, and then when it stopped, people continued with that behaviour change. That sort of incentive, it's not about anti-car, it's not about anything like that, it's about just being creative in the way that we help people make different choices. So I think a bit of a shift in regulation on pricing and ticketing. And if I was being greedy, I don't think we use technology enough for information provision.
Thank you. Yeah, totally echo your point about maybe using some sandboxes to try and get a bit of short-term regulatory change to see what the effects are. I think there's, you know, the examples on the continent are really strong in that space. So a further question from Helen Bonner at Steer to yourself, Naomi. What should central government do with respect to funding, powers and guidance to enable delivery of a step change locally?
In terms of funding, I mean, the reality is it is incredibly difficult to plan a transport system when transport funding is modal, because you are pursuing, there is a clear pathway for funding for roads, and you know what it is, you know what you're working towards, you know the timing. The same with rail to a level is you're working within a more constrained network where you know that you need to invest in the rail network, but you can only really work with the rail network that you've got. Whereas with roads, you could, you know, it's all encompassing. When you then get down to buses or walking and cycling or other forms of transport, where and indeed large local major highway schemes, where you are having to bid into little competitions, you're not comparing like with like. You're not able to make the decision on the right transport solution for that location, because what you're actually doing is finding a transport solution that fits the pot that you have access to. So that for me is one of the biggest issues. Is it's not a grown-up conversation about what's the solution to the location that we've got here. It's what kind of pot can we access. Absolutely understandably, this is not we all have to do this because of the nature of the way that the funding is set up. I think the modal funding for digital connectivity is also a huge barrier in a different government department, and we spend a lot of time trying to get traction with DCMS to understand the significant potential of improved digital connectivity to support a transport decarbonisation plan, not just because of working from home at all, but because of more improved use of connected and autonomous vehicles, but also being able to actually work as you're moving around and do that in a reliable way. That's funding. In terms of regulation, I think the regulatory barriers, so I think about Part 6 of the Traffic Management Act, which is around moving traffic enforcement outside of London. We have that legislation came in 2004, and it has still not been enacted outside of London. And yet, for the management of the highway network efficiently, that is a single piece of regulation which is actually already available that we just can't enact. I know that there is a commitment to actually make it available soon, but soon we've been waiting some time for that, and it's that kind of barrier of actually making the best of the regulation that we've got. Of course, new regulation is necessary to make different changes, and I think actually on the innovation side, that's where we really need to make the most, and some of the behaviour change in terms of carrot and stick that I was talking about earlier. But let's just make the most of what we got as a starter.
Thank you. So we've got quite a string of questions to work through, I'm afraid, Naomi, now. So from Tom Worsley at University of Leeds, viable active travel and public transport requires high density residential and commercial development. How do you persuade people to opt for less space, e.g. small or no gardens, in order to enable them to manage without owning a car? So that's quite a chunky question, really.
Gosh. I mean, it is a sector-wide discussion where if I were moving, and I will put my hand up, I actually wrote the Eco Towns Prospectus in 2008. So I feel like we've been discussing this for a long time and never found the answer. And there's a reason for that. So some work that was done by Bidwell's, a residential and commercial developer that worked quite a lot in the Oxford Cambridge Art region, showed that the biggest motivation for where a large R&D company locates is access to good, high quality public transport. It was a fantastic piece of research that showed that. That doesn't answer the question about residential development. I think community space is really important, and we've certainly seen through the pandemic the power of community space and people having access and a much greater local engagement. But people need to see that working before they then trust it and move to that community on faith that that's the way that would work. We've seen it again on the continent that people are willing to live in slightly different tenures and different structures of communities based on the fact that they have much greater access to public space. The reality is you need the public space first, and therefore you need people to be able to have access to designing communities and have funding to do that before you then take away from individuals, because individuals won't feel confident to do that. But it's a very, very, very hard question, and I think it needs a whole sector response.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Naomi. A question from a colleague, Hannah Thomas at Steer, and I warn you, it's from a resident of your area, Naomi. As a resident within your area, I am delighted to hear such passion for decarbonisation, although embarrassed at our higher than average transport contribution. Like many areas within the UK, we have large school trip-related traffic during the peak. Do you think there are ways we could better use the enthusiasm of teenagers and university students to change behaviour for the longer term whilst the infrastructure catches up?
If I can indulge myself in a little story, I went to the Milton Keynes Youth Council when we were developing the transport strategy and did a big grand presentation about transport decarbonisation and how the youth of the future had very different views on how they move around. And one lovely, clever young teenage boy put his hand up and said to me, how dare you as a middle-aged person accuse me or suggest to me that I won't want to aspire to own a Ferrari? And I thought, well, actually, you know, it comes back to that point of choice. He said his version was, I will find other ways of decarbonising my life, but I want to own a Ferrari. That's my career aspiration. Do you know what? Who could hold that against him? Actually, this week I did see an electric Ferrari, so a converted electric Ferrari. So maybe the world is an answer. But in general, going back to younger people, I think it's actually the parents that have a responsibility to teach their children. And it comes back to this point about knowing the communities. So I will put my hand up and say quite often my children would like to cycle to school, but I haven't got the time to support them, and therefore I don't allow it. And that is a terrible, terrible confession. What they need is a safe cycle route to get there on their own. They are 11 and 12, and that's the standard line for Sustrans to measure the quality of a cycle route should be that an 11-year-old should be able to cycle safely on their own. There are dangerous points, and what we don't have is the ability for local residents to identify those and actually see a pathway through to getting them changed. And I think some of LTN 120, which is the new walking and cycling guidance that came out last year, is really critical to implementing some of that, and the new local transport plans will allow some of that to come through. And but I think it is about how adults embed that change now. The other thing, sorry, I will stop, but is about actually the overwhelm. It comes back to the point about COP26. It's quite overwhelming if you look at it as a whole. And what we need to do is get individuals, young individuals, to actually be able to know how they can attribute their behaviour to a carbon reduction. And then they can make choices like my lovely young man in Milton Keynes. He can make that choice, that's fine, if he makes other decisions to reduce his carbon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Question from Mike Goss. Gosh, this is another tough question. Your presentation illustrated the degree of complexity in England's administrative boundaries. 2 questions. 1, do you think the boundaries between agencies, authorities, and complexity is appropriate for achieving their carbon intent? And secondly, how do we best equip the elected representatives to consider and make what are likely to be tough decisions with little immediate payback? Sorry, I think that.
Gosh, absolutely fantastic questions. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, good. Fantastic questions. On administrative boundaries, I mean, the short answer is no. We could spend our whole lives trying to review administrative boundaries and not get anything done. And actually, the point is you just have to work collaboratively to get through them. It is difficult. It's very difficult politically. And certainly in my region, I see this all the time, is that the politicians are quite happy to work across political parties and across boundaries, as long as they've got an end goal. The harder question is the second one, where actually, and we saw this last year with the Emergency Active Travel Funding, the implications of making bold decisions from the public is quite significant, and it's very hard for a local authority member to try and drive through an ambition when the funding is against them, because they have to go into competitive pots that they might win, they might not win. It's just easier to pursue something through a clearer route like road, or particularly the national highways sort of funding pots where they're clearer, or indeed rail, of course. And they don't know how it's going to land locally. So the uncertainties are funding and local appetite, and they're both such huge uncertainties that it's not worth them taking those risks, because it's such a huge battle. I remember when I was head of cycling in the Department for Transport, actually the trigger for change in that is actually where you get media buy-in. So the Times has a huge commitment towards cycling, and actually that media buy-in creates a movement that allows political change, because it's got backup from the media. And for me, when I was reflecting on this webinar, I think that's where actually decarbonisation just doesn't have the media drive behind it to generate action amongst communities.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. Final call for questions. Please don't forget, questions can come in on the chat function, and then we will share them with Naomi, who is absolutely facing into all the issues at the heart of all of the questions that are being raised. Further question from Robin Topper from Steer, again saying, thank you for a great presentation. You mentioned the correlation of emissions with the rural population within the EEH region. How can we best ensure that car-dependent rural communities are not left behind within the scope of a place-based approach?
Gosh, Robin, that's another great question, and one we grapple with an awful lot. I mean, so there's a social equality point here about isolated rural communities where car dependent, there is a current car dependence, and actually if people don't have access to a car, they naturally have they're socially excluded anyway. That aside, I think the answer is also to accept that public transport needs to be commercially viable, and therefore you need to be real in what you're actually planning. We're doing a lot of work across the STBs, Midlands Connect is doing a huge amount of work, Transport East and EEH particularly, on rural connectivity. There are a number of things. One of the really key ways that we're looking at the moment and really trying to get off the ground is mobility hubs. So you have small areas. I mean, one option, of course, could be historic railway stations, small railway stations that aren't used a lot of the time at the moment. But that's a shame. They're historic buildings. They're in the middle of communities. They should be used more as mobility hubs where people could come. They probably need to drive there from some of the more rural areas, but they connect in to a reliable public transport where there is a high enough volume of people to move them, possibly by bus, possibly by rail, possibly by other forms of transport, depending on the scale on the volume of movements. But at those mobility hubs, they have access to a space to do a bit of remote working, some form of public amenity, you know, a little post office, bit of dry cleaning, all those things that you do that would obviously a coffee point that would motivate you to go to that point and move your journey on. That's an area that we're looking at a lot. Mobility hubs and not alone, it's quite common. The challenge is actually getting funding for them, because how do you create a sort of business case for a mobility hub where it's conceptual? And it comes back to that point about mode specific funding.
Brilliant, thank you. And that concludes the Q&A for this Movement Matters session. Naomi, thank you very much for standing in the spotlight, as to put it, as some very challenging and thought-provoking questions came in. Just a little bit of a reminder that this is the first in our seminar series, our Movement Matters seminar series for the week. Set the bar incredibly high. Thank you, Naomi. And as you can see, we will be covering a range of themes. If you wish to participate, please register via steergroup.com. And I just want to extend an enormous thank you to Naomi for the candour and the facts and the insights that you shared with us all during your presentation, but also during the Q&A. I think you've given us all a very clear reminder of both our personal and our professional responsibilities as we help the transport industry and the wider economy move towards a low carbon, zero carbon future. Thank you very much for giving us such depth of insight and such rich personal perspective. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure the 100 or so attendees that we've got will have done likewise. Thank you again, Naomi.
Thank you very much for all the fantastic questions. I really appreciate them, and they're all, really challenging food for thought for us to take back to the office as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And that concludes Monday's Movement Matters seminars. Don't forget, sign up for others this week. Please go along to steergroup.com. Thanks very much. Have great days, everybody. Bye-bye.